Welcome to MiWeek. I'm Stephen Henderson, editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. I'm sitting in for Christy McDonald, who's off tonight. We're at our Midtown studios in Detroit. It's been just over 3 weeks since the city elected a new mayor, an election some have called one of the most important in the city's history. But with an emergency manager in place and the validity of the bankruptcy soon to be decided, what exactly will be Mayor Mike Duggan's role? Tonight we sit down with Duggan and discuss his plans for the city's future. I'm joined tonight by my counterpart at the Detroit News, editorial page editor Nolan Finley, and our special guest tonight, Mayor-elect Mike Duggan. Welcome back to the set.
Well, thanks for having me.
Let's start with this. Kevyn Orr told me last week that he imagined the roles that would be carved out for you as bigger than a COO plus some other things. You've been talking with him about how this will work come January. Is that the impression that you get?
You know, if it's a COO plus role, we won't have any trouble working it out. So, you know, I don't like the fact there's an emergency manager here, but reality is what it is, and under the emergency manager law, he has the authority to assume all responsibility or delegate some part of it. And obviously, I feel like the voters elected me because they wanted city services to get improved in a hurry, and if I've got broad enough authority to do that, I will sign up for it, and a COO plus role would work.
What would you say is the most important thing for you to have some say over come January?
Well, I don't think there's any question the driving issue in the city is public safety, and we have got to go after the police response time. But those are things that we're still working through, and whether I will be responsible for public safety or not is something that has not been resolved. So, you know, we're going through it, you know, issue by issue, and hopefully in the next 2 weeks we'll have a formal agreement that would get reduced to an order that the emergency manager would enter.
So when you think about what a COO would do, what's it look like to you, and what would the plus be?
Well, I'm not sure what the plus is, but you know, I spent 14 years as a deputy county executive. I was a COO, so I know exactly what a COO is. But you know, I want the ability to go in and deal with the fact that these street light repairs are too darn slow. I want to be able to straighten out. Right now, we got about 7 different cooks in the blight kitchen. We need to have a single blight strategy, and I had the opportunity to sit down with Dan Gilbert in the last week. What he's doing on the blight authority is just phenomenal. If we can corral all the different people doing things and go to a single Department of Neighborhoods, as I outlined in the campaign, I think we can make an impact on the quality of life of the neighborhoods in the first year. So I want to have enough authority to be able to do those things, respecting that I'm going to have to operate within Mr. Orr's budget. I have to operate in a way that does not disrupt what's going on in his litigation, bankruptcy, and to the extent he's set up frameworks and collective bargaining agreements, or to the extent he wants to sign off on major appointments, those things are all fine. And so something along those lines could conceivably work.
So you mentioned collective bargaining agreements. Should you be the one negotiating with the union, since you're the one who's going to have to live with the contracts long term?
You know, there's 2 ways to look at it. One is that the emergency manager is putting forward a plan of adjustment to the bankruptcy court, which has to be accepted by the judge, and we don't get out of bankruptcy. And so he certainly has an intense interest in making sure that those agreements fit within his parameters. I have an intense agreement to make sure that we can afford them in the long run. So our interests are probably aligned. But if I were the emergency manager, I would want to sign off on these agreements because I've got an obligation to live up to my representations to the court. So those kinds of conversations are the kinds of discussions we're having. They're all professional, they're all rational, but it's very complicated and it's very detailed. We're trying to work through it.
Are you talking principally with Kevyn, or are you also talking with Governor Snyder, who I know wants to have a pretty active role in shaping this partnership?
You know, I'm talking to both, but it's very clear that the emergency manager is in charge, and just as the statute suggests, he really is in charge, and ultimately, I believe the emergency manager is going to decide.
So
what
you
it looks
don't
like.
get a sense that Lansing's pulling the strings and calling the shots here?
You know, it's hard for me to tell what goes on when I'm not in the room, but my conversations with the governor have been very constructive, and I see lots of ways for the city and state to partner, and I feel very good about that.
What about talent? We hired a new CFO last week. It seemed like somebody
Right.
who we should be pleased to see come to Detroit, but it also seemed pretty clear that that was Kevyn's pick.
I would not, again, I don't think so. I think the CFO worked out ideally.
Yeah.
Which is, I sat in on the main interview.
Okay.
I was totally impressed. I spent 2 hours with him. And after an hour, I said to him, I don't want you to think of this in terms of 6 months or 8 months for an emergency manager. I'd like you to think in terms of being the CFO for the next 4 years. Mr. Hill is just phenomenally headed up the oversight board when Washington, D.C. Was under an emergency manager. He talked to me about how he got citizens positively engaged, which is something I've seen lacking here in our particular situation. But I've dealt with a lot of CFOs, both in the private sector and the public sector, and Mr. Hill was far better than what I would have expected us to be able to attract as a public sector CFO. So we made the offer together. My understanding is Mr. Hill insisted on hearing from me before he made a decision. And so the reason that we announced it jointly was Mr. Orr has indicated he wants him here for his tenure. I've indicated to Mr. Hill I want him here for my tenure, and this truly was an example of what working together could produce.
What about talent and the rest of the administration? I mean, you've got a lot of jobs to fill. It's unclear as of yet, I guess, how many of them that you'll get to fill by January. How's that all going?
You know, we've got a transition office open in Cadillac Towers. There's a dozen people working, 60 and 80-hour weeks assessing that talent and the like. And so we'll know the details, but obviously I expect to be the person primarily recruiting the cabinet. We have got to shift from this consultant-based government that we have today to getting the permanent people in place who are going to start to run the departments.
So if you were given a larger role, do you believe you could get rid of some of those consultants who are quite expensive for the city? Do you think you can replace them with folks who might serve you long term?
I think we need to start transitioning down so that every month that goes by on the operational side, I'm not talking about the ones supporting the bankruptcy litigation, but the consultants supporting the day-to-day operations, I'd like to see us to start to phase down that money and put your money into the permanent people who will be running the departments. And yes, I do think I can phase it down.
What about the city's finances and the money for the restructuring? We saw that the state has said they're only going to pay $5 million, so they're going to cap their contribution at that. Kevyn has moved some other money into restructuring. How much of that do you agree with? How much of that might you change?
I haven't gotten into it enough. I still need to see what form that 50-50 agreement took. Is it in writing? Is it specific? Now they're saying we only meant 50-50 on some, but I haven't looked at it carefully enough to give you an informed answer on that.
Now, you and Kevyn Orr both have strong personalities, and you both are used to being the guy in charge. Do you know enough about him? Do you know him well enough now to know whether you can have this sort of good working relationship that you can get along on a day-to-day basis?
Time is going to tell, but I spent 14 years as a COO, as Deputy County Executive. I spent the last 12 years as CEO, both as prosecutor and as CEO of the Detroit Medical Center. I understand very clearly the role between the two, and the emergency financial manager law in this state makes Kevyn Orr the CEO. I understand the difference between the roles, and so the answer is, if there's a clear COO structure, I'll live with it as I did for 14 years before. I don't have a problem professionally operating under that structure.
Are the things an emergency manager can do better than the mayor at this point, make some of the political decisions and what have you, that you might not want to take the heat for?
Yeah, taking the heat doesn't bother me at all. So no, I don't see that there's any value laying the blame on somebody else to do the right thing. I'm perfectly willing to do the right thing and explain why.
So you mentioned earlier that you really want to get after police and police response time. I mean, everybody agrees that's a huge priority. How do we do that? I mean, given the number of police we have, given the shortage of resources in the department, is that something that you feel like can be accomplished in a short window of time?
I came into the Detroit Medical Center when it was 3 to 4 hours to see a doctor in an emergency room, and 4 months later we were seeing virtually everybody in 29 minutes because we tore the process apart. I have questions about the dispatch system. I have questions about how long it takes to drop prisoners off at the lockup. There are a whole series of practices that I believe that we could change that would allow the officers to spend more of their shift on the street responding and less of their shift into other bureaucratic responsibilities. And so I would go after it by tearing apart the process. I think we can shorten the police response time with the staff we have.
So we also saw Chief Craig make a big show, really, of a very aggressive move against an apartment building where he said there was, more calls, I guess, than they were getting from other places. Have you talked to him yet about that as a strategy? Is that the kind of strategy that you think will work in Detroit?
I think the raids were great police work by the Detroit Police Department. Here's what I'd like to see, and what you used to see 10 years ago when I was a prosecutor, is the next day or the day after, we would say, of the 30 people who were arrested, here's how many had federal gun crimes that had been flipped to the feds. Here's how many were state probation or parole violators and the state's taken them back to prison. Here's a number charged by the county prosecutor. Here's a number still in jail today. And so
it's that follow-up.
I think what
important.
Chief Gregg did was excellent on the raid. I don't see all the other police agencies stepping up 24 or 48 hours later and saying, here's what we did as a follow-up. Maybe they have and they haven't announced it, but that would be what I would contribute. I think Chief Gregg's doing a fine job. I don't see the other agencies pulled together in a single united strategy the way we had 10 years ago, and I'd like to see us get back to that.
Is the chief moving with the same sort of urgency you would expect if he were working for you?
He's done a number of things right. I think the changes he's made in the leadership of the department have made it more professional. I think he's improved the morale of the officers. I think he's moved very effectively on those fronts. Now we're to the point there that you've got a professional management team, you got better morale. Now can we take the next step? And I think now's what he's going to be judged on, and if I'm responsible, what I would be judged on.
Are you sensing from your residents that they feel a difference?
No. As far as the experience of the neighborhood, the safety, no, it hasn't changed. But
how long before you feel like people will feel like things are better or they're safer?
I think in the first year, you can go after these gun crimes aggressively. You can shut down these drug houses, seize them, not just raid them over and over. Get the feds involved on these gun crimes. I know Barb McQuaid has expressed a willingness, and they're doing some of it, not nearly to the extent that they have in places like New York and Richmond, where they had huge effects on the violence. And so you can have an effect in the first year.
Now, at best, Detroit solves about 10% of it, or 30% of its murders. At worst, 10%. A lot of people who commit murder in Detroit go unpunished. You were a former prosecutor. Do you have ideas or thoughts on how you get that conviction rate up so people know they can't get away with murder in Detroit?
And again, if you go back to 2001 when I started, we put together a cold case task force that involved the state police, the FBI, the Detroit police, the prosecutor, the attorney general, and we went back on cases that were 6 months, a year, 2, 3 years old, solved them, and what we found was the people who got away with it a year or two ago were still committing murders today. And so when we put that targeted energy in it, it helped contribute to reducing the murder rate. And so there's no doubt that clearing homicides is a high priority, and it needs to be a high priority.
So tell us about something that surprised you since the election. Your whole world has to have changed in some ways. Tell me about something that's unexpected.
I got a call from HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, who calls and says, "Can I have dinner with you?" Which never happened to me before.
Didn't happen before.
So a half hour before dinner, he calls me and says, "Kathleen Sebelius, the HHS secretary, is going to be in town. Do you mind if she joins us?" And so I ended up at a 3-hour dinner with 2 cabinet officers who came in to see me to talk about what we could do for the city of Detroit. The level of interest in this country to help this city is enormous. We need to be competent enough to take advantage of that help and actually change the quality of life.
Well, isn't that one of your first priorities then when you do get some responsibility, or when you do take office? A lot of pent-up demand or pent-up desire to help Detroit from both the National Foundation communities and the federal government, and yet there's still not confidence amongst either community that Detroit can use the money well.
One of the most critical things that we've got to accomplish in a transition team, we don't have it done yet, but I expect we will in the next 6 weeks, is how do we accept help? And it's not just foundations. There's lots of people offering their time. There's lots of companies volunteering talent. There are different companies saying, "Hey, I might want to come invest in Detroit." I need to find a way that when they call you, you don't say, "I'll get back to you," which they've heard for years, but to say, "Here's how you can help, and let me have this person get in touch with you." And I've got to complete that in the next 6 weeks.
So right before the election, I think it was in the last debate, you said that you would like to see by year 4 Detroit's population going up, which would be, I think it was the boldest promise you made, frankly, during the campaign. I mean, we have not seen population increase in this city since, I think, 1958 or 9. What should Detroit citizens see or look at to say that's possible, that could happen in the first 4 years?
I expect it to happen. I mean, I will consider my run a failure if by the 4th year the population in the city is not growing. And I have a very clear idea how I want to get there. We all know that downtown, midtown, riverfront, large numbers of people are moving in. But they're moving out of the neighborhoods a whole lot faster than people are coming in. But if I could, in the first year, get the police response time down, get the street lights starting to come on, and get the abandoned buildings starting to be dealt with. Not that it's all solved, but that people see it's happening. You got people who think that they can't sell their house for half of what it's worth, but they're bailing out on the city anyway. If they see the cops starting to show up, the streetlights coming on, they'll say, you know what, I'll wait another year. I'll hang in here another year. When we hit that point, everything's going to start to turn. And when we stabilize the quality of life of the neighbors and people start to stay, with all the areas we have people moving in, I do think it is very much achievable by year 4 the population of this city starts to grow again.
Okay, well, we'll have to see 4 years from now. We'll hold you to that.
Well, you probably got a tape up.
That's right, now it's on tape.
We're going to be playing that every 6 months.
We'll be back with more My Week in a minute.